everyone. So as we've seen, we have a new Nobel Prize in Literature awardee. We have a new laureate, and it's a 53-year-old South Korean woman named Han Kang. She was something of a household name amongst the people who perhaps watch my channel because she won the International Booker Prize. But even despite that, she was not somebody that I had really considered because of how old she was and how small her oeuvre was that had been translated into English. And so on came the flood of I told you so's. I knew she was going to win. No, you didn't. But this is a person that we can review quite quickly and easily because a lot of her books are quite short, and there's only 4 or 5 of them in total. I've read 3, and I thought we could go through them back to back and talk about generally what I think about her, and more specifically about each of her books, before I recommend really one of the 3 that I read as being something that people should pick up. The first book of hers I read was The Vegetarian, which is the book that probably contributed the most to her Nobel Prize win, because that was the book that got her the International Booker Prize, the first time that it was awarded to a single book and not an author's entire work. The Vegetarian is a book about a woman who decides not to eat meat, and then she has some unsatisfying sex, and she decides she wants to turn into a tree. And these radical changes to this woman's life are seen through 3 perspectives, and we never see really inside the woman's head. The first perspective gives us the social and kind of gender political viewpoint of her husband. The second viewpoint gives this kind of sensory viewpoint of her through her brother-in-law, I think. And the third perspective gives this familial sense as the woman is confined to a mental hospital and her sister tries to care for her. The book makes total structural sense, and I love it for that, but the main key issue with it is that it is unbelievably boring. I feel like these 3 viewpoints are absolute cutouts, including the sister at the end of the book that we're meant to relate to more. These people are so boring. I thought the husband was so stereotypical and too unlikable to be even realistic. Because there's not a single good thing or even relatable thing about her husband, it makes that first section feel more like a social satire and less like a kind of dark drama that I think the author is going for. If he was more of a flawed character, it would have created layers to the situation, but a layered situation really doesn't feel like it's what Han Kang is going for. Then the second viewpoint, which is the brother-in-law, he's literally the guy from American Beauty who's like, oh, the paper bag. But this guy has a way more unrealistic viewpoint that we're still meant to kind of understand. And the insistence that the kinky shit he was doing was deep and important was so boring, and I really didn't feel like the author was satirizing these kind of self-important people. It felt like she was just being self-important. Thematically, I was confused by some of the transitions in the book. The book, as I said, has this social satire bit at the beginning where it's making fun of the woman and her very specific connections, and then it transfers into this kind of parable or like weird moral tale about like succumbing to primal urges and how that affects the people around you. And I felt like the transition between the 2 was not very clean. And the reason for that is because it was extremely clear to me that Han Kang really only wanted to focus on the latter part, this idea of rejecting human violence and consumption. And the entire first viewpoint really doesn't matter. And I say it doesn't matter. What I mean is that the author doesn't care about that part. I felt like there was definitely a sense of comedy in the first part that was deliberate. The first part in general was my favorite, but the section in that first part when the family's holding her down and trying to get her to eat meat, that's all ridiculous. I didn't take that seriously at all. And then she cuts her wrist, and I was laughing. I was laughing at that bit. And I was not sure if the author wanted me to laugh, but it was funny how ridiculous the situation got. And I didn't take it as some realistic interpretation of circumstance or some realistic portrayal of South Korea. The second she cuts herself, all of the family is like, yes, that force-feeding her was bad, but why doesn't she eat the meat? I mean, it's very irresponsible of her, you know. The framing in the first 2 parts of the book informs why the woman would want to detach from society in the way that she does. She views her husband as an unlikable person. She sees instances of consumption. Her husband's trying to get her to conform, and the guy in the second part is trying to consume her in a way, and she reacts very passively to these things. It's not like a hunger strike. She's reacting passively. She just doesn't want to do these things. But the way that that's set out in a very logical sense, where that's the way that the reader is understanding why she's doing those things, by the third part, she's deteriorated so much that I cannot empathize with her or view her as a person who has realistically responded to the world around her. The point that we get to at the end feels like the author is insisting that the woman shouldn't be in a mental hospital and she should be free to explore her primal urges and try to become a tree, and I find that utterly unrelatable unrelatable, and I cannot respect that as like an authorial intent. The problem is that the woman is just nuts, like that she's clearly nuts. It's not some deep, meaningful point by the end. It kind of is at the beginning. Her wanting to be a vegetarian and not wanting to eat that is totally fair. Her wanting to be a tree at the end and having like literally gone mad, I don't feel like the first 2/3 and the final third connect properly because of how far the woman has gone. And all of you reading this, if you saw a woman try to strip down and run out into the woods and try to become a tree by standing on her hands, you're not really trying to deconstruct the nuance of her thought process. And Han Kang is being unreasonable to expect us to view her a certain way because of that. A major problem with the book for me as well is how slow and plodding and boring the narrator voices are, and how boring Han Kang's writing style is. It says she has an intensely poetic prose. I do not agree. The final third of this book is so long. We spend so long with this woman just refusing to eat over and over. It is so boring. And oh my god, she's clearly just lost it. It's not that deep. If the book were a little more fragmentary and were jumping around more, and I'll talk about that with human acts later, if the book was just doing more, I would have enjoyed it more. But the final third is like just the dullest thing. The ending third is what the author clearly wants you to be left thinking about. The ending third is the stuff that the author thinks matters, and I think that the ending third is stupid. The deliberate omission of seeing inside this woman's head is very clear. We're meant to be viewing her through the people around her. The viewpoints of the other people towards her is the point of the book, and I really like that. And the first 2/3 really set that up. But in the final third, the sister and the woman we're focusing on have been removed from society. And in that section, Han Kang is trying to get us to understand, yes, she should strip down and become a tree. That's how she should think. And I find that utterly unrelatable. And even though the sister character also finds that unrelatable, it really feels like the author wants us to empathize with this mad woman and not view her as a mad woman, which she is. Apart from some disturbing imagery that I really liked, there's one section where they talk about how they killed and ate a dog that attacked somebody that I thought was really good. Apart from these disturbing moments, the final 2/3 of this book are extremely dull and meandering, and I could not care. I don't know how these sections can feel as long as they do, but the final 2 sections of the book, I wanted to close the book and be done with it, really. If this book is a parable on conformity and succumbing to primal urges, these are not subjects that I find interesting or worthwhile positions for a parable to focus on. I feel like I've seen it a million times, and this book doesn't add too much unique to it. And I will be the first to admit that I am absolutely biased by the fact that this author won the Nobel Prize, because the whole time that I was reading this book, I was thinking, how did the person who wrote this deserve the same award as the person who wrote, like, Omeros or something like that? It's just not comparable. So that was my general thoughts on The Vegetarian. I thought it was okay, leaning towards me not enjoying it. I'm glad that I read it, though. This compelled me to read it more than anything else, and it probably would have been a while before I read this particular International Booker winner. The next book I read from Han Kang was a book called The White Book, and it's a book about everything white. This is the book that best illustrates the intensely poetic prose that was cited by the Nobel Committee. I do not feel like this author has an intensely poetic prose. She has an intensely boring prose, and the poetic stuff in it is not unique at all, and I've seen all of her expressions said before. There is no truly new turn of phrase, there's no truly new concept, and the whole time that I was reading this book, I was deathly bored. The author seems to think that they're saying new things with this book, and the reader is encouraged to believe them because the book is sparse and there are large gaps between paragraphs. I think of Tokarczuk, and I still haven't read Flight, but I have read Primeval and Other Times, and the structuring of that book is similarly, like, nebulous. But that book is so dense with historical and social detail, it encourages you to, like, Google it. Whereas this book has no grounding at all. It's just these sort of nebulous thoughts of the author, and there isn't even really a core concept to kind of tie it down. Like, I mean, the book pretends there is, with the death of the woman's sister when she was very, very young. But the book really is not focusing on that, and I think of that What I'd Rather Not Think About, that was shortlisted for the International Booker recently. That book is also quite nebulous and quite sort of broad, but in every single moment that's a sort of meandering thought of the narrator, you can feel the core concept. It feels like it's tied back to it. Whereas in this book, even though I know that the author is clearly trying to imply that she's always thinking about the sister that died and how momentous that was, there are large stretches of the White Book that feel totally pointless. It's unanchored and it's relying entirely on the author's talent, and that's just not something I find particularly engaging. Although I wouldn't say that what the book is doing feels random, at least not structurally. There are moments that I liked. For example, there's long stretches where the author is talking about city life and her response to city life, and at the end of the book, I think the mother mentions that if the sister had been living in the city at the time, or the family had been living in the city when the sister was born, the sister might still be alive because they could have gotten a different medical care. So it gives this retrospectively interesting viewpoint onto why the narrator is focusing on the city. And I like stuff like that. That's good. But I think that the actual writing of the book is very milquetoast and boring, and that's more what I'm talking about. There are authors that work for me that rely entirely on their talent because they're also so nutball that they make it interesting. This is more like Anne Michaels to me, where it thinks that what it's doing is really unique and really poetic and profound, but it just does not. Some of the passages in this are really nice. Anything describing the city is quite nice. The final 5 or 10 pages are quite nice. But I wound up taking nothing out of this book because of how sparse and how clean it is. So yeah, not a book I'm gonna remember. It is what it is. And again, we're saying that this is better writing than like Cartarescu or anything like that. Like, come off it. So this whole time I've been mostly shitting on this author, and I will say that while I was reading some of her books, I wanted to die, basically, thinking about Alexis Wright sitting by the phone waiting for the call. But then I read Human Acts, which was the final of the 3 books that I read, and my opinion on her changed a little bit. This book was awesome. This book, Human Acts, it's about the aftermath of the Gwangju massacre, focusing on a few different people in the years and decades following it as they think back on a boy who died in it. Although they don't all think back on it all the time, they're living their lives, and eventually each chapter comes back to focusing on this boy, Dong Ho, who died in, I think, 1980. I thought this book was great. I still don't get on with her writing style, and this book was no exception, but where this book really excels is in how much it's doing, and in how kind of specific and brutal it gets. Poetic writing like this author's is a speed run for me to sound as stagnant as possible, and the final third of The Vegetarian was unbearable because of that. In this book, the author doesn't give themselves the chance to be boring because they're changing the setting every 20 pages, they're changing the way they approach the story, and this is exactly what I want from them. The frenetic energy of the book really overcomes Han Kang's own tepidity, and there's always new ways of telling the story and new sort of structural inventions that really help to push the message forward. For example, the second person in this book is really good. I like that second person voice. The character Dong Ho in the first chapter, I was like, why is the second person? This is quite weird. And then every consecutive chapter used second person as a way to refer to the boy. And so that gave the boy this really sort of like intense presence where the characters in the chapters after the first one are talking in the first person or the third person. They're walking around and thinking about their lives. And then the second we hear the word you, they are referring to the boy in the first chapter. And it always means that they're in the background because you is such a prominent word. And so whenever he gets mentioned, it feels like he's been hovering over the chapter the whole time and he's finally appearing, you know what I mean? Whenever you crops up in another chapter, it comes after a little while, and it feels like this immense specter is just haunting even how the characters talk. It's awesome. From the second section onwards, this book levels up. It starts with the POV of a corpse, and the corpse is describing how it's been thrown on a mound of other bodies, and the bottom layer of the mound is rotting away, and there's these spirits that are mingling around each other, and it's a crazy POV section that comes right after a really grounded viewpoint of this boy looking after the dead bodies in the aftermath of this massacre. Then we get to the third section, which is focusing on this woman forgetting the slaps that were given to her face when she was being interrogated. This is happening years after the event itself, and she's still describing her process in trying to forget that, and we see her life in really granular detail. Maybe she's washing up, maybe she's at her job. I think she's an editor in that section, and all through those sections she's just pondering those slaps. It's not even thinking about them in a a traumatic way. She's just proposing questions about them, like, who was the man who slapped me? How was his life? Why did the sixth one hurt the most? And stuff like that. It's not even really pondering them in like a PTSD sort of way. It's just thinking about this thing that is still hovering in her life. And the way it shows how that's just taken root as part of her personality, basically, is so good and so sad. A major problem for me with the other books by Han Kang that I read is that they're just too vague. With this book, it's so specific. That first section, which is the longest one, I think, is so specific as we see this boy as he cleans up after the dead. And the detail is like, how did you even think of that? It's very clear the environment that this book is taking place in, as opposed to the other two. As this book, Human Acts, moves through time, it becomes sadder and more personal, until it gets to the last couple of chapters where we see the mother, and the mother gives her viewpoint decades after the fact. And she talks about the feelings that she got when her boy came home and how it was to go to his funeral and so on. It's extremely sad, and it's a brutal gut punch of an ending. And then the epilogue of the book introduces the author as they talk about their process of discovering this boy and what that meant. And that was a section that I thought I would hate and find sort of really self-important, but I didn't. I actually thought that the author's inclusion at the end was a steady process of making the story more personal. And when it got to hers, I actually thought it was the most emotional part of the book. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I will say that some of the writing did feel a little long. There's one section which was involving the woman who I believe was tortured sexually, and that section was a little too long. But overall, I was left with a very good impression of the book, and I'm glad that I read this one. This is the one that I would say I enjoyed the most. In summary, I don't feel like Han Kang is an especially good Nobel Prize winner. She's quite young. She has quite a small oeuvre, as I said, that's been translated into English. But mostly I was not really connecting with all of her books. I feel like she's won it quite early on, but I think we'll see more of her work translated. But with this author, the bar is just too high for her to hit, and it doesn't help that I find her writing quite slow and plodding. I will say that Human Acts, that book, I'd happily recommend that to anyone who's interested, and I'd say if you were going to read one book from this author, make sure it's that one. But other than that, that's what I think of that author. I'm sure I'll read more from her. I think there's another book from her coming out next year, and I'll probably read that too. So thanks so much. Bye!